Hello and welcome, I'm Ali Mustafa and this is Strait Talk. Can Syria's warring sides find common ground in Sochi, or will disagreements derail the process once again? Plus, a decades-old military alliance is under threat. We look at events that stirred mistrust between Turkey and NATO. And we go behind the scenes to get a sense of Turkey's soft power. Since 2012, Syrian peace talks have been associated and named after the cities they've been held in: Astana, Geneva, Sochi. Warring sides have taken to neutral ground to find a solution, but peace remained elusive. On Wednesday, Geneva hosted opposite sides in the Syrian conflict. These included a fractured opposition and a delegation from Bashar al-Assad's regime. Sochi, where talks wrapped up last week, saw Russia, Turkey and Iran come together. A lot was discussed, from Bashar al-Assad's future to the Syrian opposition groups that will be allowed to attend future peace talks. But for Turkey, one issue in particular was of particular importance: the PKK terror group linked YPG in Afrin. It's a landlocked area in northwestern Syria where Russian military observers are also present. Turkey, which recently sent troops to neighboring Idlib, insists the YPG is unacceptable in Afrin. The group has received US aid, training and air support in its fight against Daesh. Ankara has warned for months and again this week of a potential military operation to clear Afrin of YPG. And now with the Sochi talks laying the framework for a wider peace conference to bring all of Syria's warring sides together, officials in Ankara want their Russian and Iranian partners to provide a clear roadmap on YPG in Afrin. And to discuss this further, I'm joined in the studio by Timur Akhmetov. He's an analyst at the Russian International Affairs Council, and by Hussein Alptekin. He's a professor of international relations at Istanbul Şehir University. There's so many moving parts to this. It's between Sochi, Geneva, between Assad and the Turks, the Russians and the Iranians. What's actually going on in your mind, Timur? Let's begin with you.
I think that after the defeat of the ISS, we can see that Russia is intensifying diplomatic efforts to bring forward the conflict into the political and diplomatic dimension. So it basically tries to finish the military dimension of the conflict, and that's why it brings in the negotiations Turkey and Iran, main regional actors. And by doing this, actually, Russia is trying to increase its diplomatic stance vis-a-vis United States.
So, Sen, is it like an exchange between Turkey and Russia that you can take on the YPG in Afrin as long as we get to keep Assad in power in Damascus?
It has some truthfulness in that, but it's not that simple. It's not like give YPG and take Assad. It's not that simple. But there's some part of truth in that depiction. So on the one hand, now Turkey's primary concern in Syria is the growing influence of the YPG, the PKK affiliated group in Syria. And that's number one security threat for Turkish national interest. So of course, Turkey's primary concern now is about the future of the YPG, and it's about the security of its borders with Syria.
Who has more of Assad's back, Russia or Iran?
I think both countries are interested in keeping currently Assad in power, but we have to understand that Russian interest is not in keeping Assad in power forever. Ultimate interest of Russia is in keeping central government in power. So it's legitimate, yes, legitimate, be it with Assad or without Assad. The main problem that Syrian government should go on without any intervention from outside. This was the ultimate objective of the Syrian campaign of Russia.
So you're saying Russia is willing to sacrifice Assad, or will be okay if he's not there, but will Iran be all right with such a situation?
It's such a critical question. I don't have any direct, clear answers to this, but according to the Russian official statements, they were not hanging on to Assad. The main priority was the Syrian government, not Assad.
Hussein, Russia willing to sacrifice Assad? Is Iran willing to do so? Or might be? According to Timur, you know what? It's not about one man, it's about the sustainability of the regime beyond or despite Assad.
So what we know is Russia won't sacrifice its military bases, its influence, and its indirect control in Syria. And now the most useful instrument for such a direct influence in Syria is Bashar Assad. So there is no substitute for now. So I don't see Russia will sacrifice Assad in the foreseeable future. But for Iran, the ties are even tighter. So Iran is way more pro-Assad than Russia. Russia thinks Assad is a useful Assad because through Assad, Russia can control the territory.
I just want to cut you short. We've spoken so much about Russia and Iran and the YPG. We're not talking about one very significant player in all of this. The Americans and their thing about cutting the funding or cutting funding to the YPG. Let's listen to what the Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu had to say about what he said was the US cutting funds to the YPG.
President Trump has clearly stated that he has given instructions and that from now on, the YPG will not be provided with weapons and that this nonsense should have ended much earlier.
So that was Mevlut Çavuşoğlu saying that he expected that President Trump was very clear in cutting funding to the YPG. But let's listen to what the White House then said and Sarah Huckabee Sanders said about the same issue.
Once we started winning the campaign against ISIS, the plan and part of the process is to always wind down support for certain groups. Now that we're continuing to crush the physical caliphate, that we're in a position to stop providing military equipment to certain groups, but that doesn't mean stopping all support of those individual groups.
So two different opinions from Turkey and the US on the same issue. Let's begin with you, Timur.
I think that the ultimate intention of the US to keep its presence as much as possible because by keeping its military presence in the Kurdish-held territories, US can keep its position during the negotiation process and during the political resolution process, and it's crucial for the US.
Hussein, why the mixed messages?
Actually, there are certain common messages and consistent messages that come from the American side. And that's the core American stance in Syria, which is keeping a zone of control in the east of Euphrates. So this message doesn't change across the people, across the units, across the bureaucratic organizations. But beyond that, any message, any delivered response, any kind of statement, we see vast differences across different speaking bodies. In this case, and that's not unique to the Syrian case actually, from the recent Qatar crisis to the many other issues from the North Korean crisis. The American state apparatus now have multiple voices.
I want to add on to your point, and this is a report from the United States, from the Overseas Contingency Operations Comprehensive Oversight Plan for the year 2018, and it states that the Department of Defense has requested $13 billion for ongoing operations against ISIS and building the capacity of the Iraqi security forces and vetted, quote-unquote, Syrian opposition forces and funding munitions to maintain the tempo of such operations. In addition to this, another $191.5 million has been requested for Syria for areas newly liberated from ISIS, which means money going to essentially the YPG. Timur.
So this proves my position that the US will keep its position, its presence as much as possible, because without its physical presence, US will be just sidelined from the negotiating process, and this is a disaster for the whole Syrian policy of the Americans.
Hussein, I'll give you the last word.
I also don't expect the relationship between the United States and the YPG to end quite soon, because there's a mutual interest on the table there. The YPG needs America, otherwise without the American support, its primary enemy, Turkey, might intervene, and it might also have further troubles within Syria. For the American interest, the United States needs some ground forces, and they don't want to waste, they don't want to spend more money on that and more people on another war in the Middle East. So they need spearhead, they need the pound, the ground force, and they need that power to be a local force. and the YPG satisfies these two American concerns. So as long as we can see some other alternative groups in the east part of Euphrates, the United States will not cut its deals with the YPG. So can we see that change? Not likely, because the YPG itself prevented by deporting, by expelling the rival organizations in the region.
Fascinating power play. Thank you so much, Hussein Alptekin and Timur Akhmetov, for joining us in the studio. Turkey was a crucial NATO ally throughout the Cold War. And even after the demise of the Soviet Union, it participated in almost every significant operation that the alliance was involved in, from peacekeeping operations in the Balkans to the war in Afghanistan. But fractures were exposed during the war in Syria. Turkey says NATO is to blame for fraying ties, while Brussels has raised concerns about Ankara's flirtation with NATO's traditional enemies such as Russia. Despite assurances from both sides that the alliance is solid, questions remain whether NATO's golden age is long past. Ömer Kablan has more.
Efendim Türkiye Avrupa'dan uzaklaşıp NATO'dan Rusya'ya mı gidiyor? Yok böyle bir şey.
But judging by the past few months, that doesn't seem to be the case. One of the first states to join, Turkey has been an integral part of the alliance for more than 6 decades. With more than 900,000 active military personnel, Turkey commands the second largest army among NATO's 29 member states. But since the war in Syria, relations have frayed. Recently, NATO's Secretary General apologized to Turkey after Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the founder of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, were featured on an enemy chart during a NATO military exercise in Norway. And further straining ties is Turkey's increasingly closer relationship with Russia. That has caused concern among some in NATO that one of its members is seeking security solutions outside the bloc. Turkey agreed to a $2.4 billion deal to buy a long-range anti-aircraft missile system from Moscow. The S-400 is an air defense system that has a range of 400 kilometers and can shoot down up to 80 targets simultaneously. But this purchase has raised alarms in the NATO alliance. A top NATO official has even warned Turkey of the consequences. But Turkey has criticized NATO for being indifferent to its security challenges.
Şurada bir S-400 anlaşması yaptık diye çılgına döndüler ya. Ne olacaktı? Sizi mi bekleyeceğiz? Biz de başımızın çaresine bütün güvenlik noktasında tedbirlerimizi alıyoruz ve alacağız.
Turkey has also criticized its NATO ally, the United States, for funding and arming the YPG, Syrian affiliate of the PKK, which is an internationally recognized terrorist organization. Mehmet Akif Okur is a professor of international relations at Yıldız Teknik University. He feels there's been a disconnect in the alliance.
Etrafında yapılacak tartışmalar. Turkey may continue with the NATO alliance, but for this to take place, NATO needs to re-evaluate its position in dealing with threats its member states face. For example, if US support for the YPG-PYD terror groups continue, then this is not an honest partnership.
But if things don't get on the right track soon, the alliance could see its powers wane. Turkey continues to bear the brunt of fighting terrorism and providing refuge to victims fleeing war. If relations between Turkey and its NATO allies continue to spiral downward, then the military alliance could see itself lose influence in a region seeing the rise of new powers. Ömer Kablan, Strait Talk.
And to discuss the current state of the NATO-Turkey relationship, I'm joined in the studio by Emre Ersen. He's a professor at Marmara University's Department of Political Science and International Relations, as well as Matthew Breiser, who is a former US diplomat and the former US ambassador to Azerbaijan. Let's begin with you, Matthew. Is NATO still a relevant force?
Extremely so. I mean, NATO is the most successful military or political military alliance in history.
In the past.
Yeah, but still, you know, today, as we speak, NATO is essential to returning stability where? To Syria. It's part of the coalition in Syria and Ukraine, which are two of the biggest concerns on the global agenda today.
You know why I ask you that question? Because 67% of people polled in Turkey across Turkey, in 12 provinces across Turkey, believe that Turkey can handle its security needs without NATO. In other words, it doesn't need NATO. Emre.
I can understand why people said that because of what's going on in Turkey's relations with the United States and the European Union. But when it comes to NATO, I think we always need to remember that this is really a very long-standing relationship between Turkey and NATO. Turkey has been a member of this alliance since 1952. It has a veto power there, and it is one of the most important members of the NATO alliance still. So I can understand because of what's going on currently in these relations with the United States, the people might feel a little bit disappointed. But apart from that, I think when you take it strategically, I think that behavior can also change very in a very short time. As what happened with Russia 2 years ago, the same Turkish public was against any type of cooperation with Russia because of the crisis in Turkish-Russia relations. So these can change, but what we have to keep in mind is that this is a very long-standing relationship, a very strategic relationship.
A strategic relationship, but you mentioned Syria, you mentioned a few other things. Russia, Turkey, as Emre mentioned, it's a possibility, and it's a reality now with what's happening in Syria. So, again, strategic alliance?
Well, you mean between Turkey and Russia? No, I don't think so.
Not between Turkey and NATO.
Of course. That's the core of Turkey's national security, regardless of public opinion that may be anti-Western a bit for known reasons. The core of Turkey's national security interests are addressed by NATO. It's the most successful alliance in history. It can bring to bear anywhere in the world greater force than has ever been applicable to any problem. But it's also a democratic force. It's a force that brings stability by encouraging democratic change as well, and is defensive. So I don't think Turkey is tilting toward Russia in a strategic way. I think it's tactical, and understandably, Ankara is saying, Washington, wake up, we're valuable.
So the S-400 system and the purchase of that, or potential purchase of that by Turkey, it's a tactical thing, Emre?
Well, I think, when you take a look at this debate of the S-400 deal between Turkey and Russia, it has two dimensions. One of them is technical, and which is tactical, of course. And Turkey needs this system because of what's going on in Syria. It's very important to strengthen Turkey's national defense.
But my question is, why couldn't Turkey get similar systems from NATO member states, Matthew?
Well, yeah, number one, Turkey is going to pursue a European manufactured system to kind of counterbalance politically the Russian one. But number two, the key point is that Russia apparently has said Turkey can co-produce this missile system. So Turkey can get these systems elsewhere. The S-400 is a very capable system. But obtaining the technology, that's something that no one else was offering but the Russians.
Let's talk about the relationship itself. Recently, we saw a spat where certain NATO member states were accused of using the pictures of the Turkish founder, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, as target practice in a video simulation of sorts. How does that talk about the relationship? What does that tell us?
Well, the timing of that incident was definitely very unfortunate, because at a time when the public is actually against NATO and Turkey's relations with NATO, this actually came at a very unfortunate time. And I think it's very important that all the NATO officials and the Norwegian officials immediately apologized. So it's very clear that this was not intentional. So there was a mismanagement, and I think Turkey also needs to see it this way. But of course, when it comes to the public mood, it's really definitely created a huge disappointment in the Turkish public about NATO, especially at a time when everybody is actually questioning the nature of that relationship.
It's an interesting parallel, because on the one hand, Turks are questioning the relationship, but so are the Americans, especially the US administration, with Donald Trump saying, I'm going to cut NATO funding, cut NATO financing, threatening, using that as a threat against European countries. So something to bring the two countries together?
No, I don't think so. I think President Trump has changed his tune quite a bit on NATO. His visit there back in the early summer really kind of, I think, helped him appreciate how valuable the alliance is. And frankly, the U.S.-Turkish relations now are on a very negative trajectory, and I think something needs to be done to change the way the two countries' governments communicate to each other. The typical bureaucratic mechanisms, of which I was a part, are not working.
It's quite interesting that all these issues kind of seem to be converging. What's Turkey's play then, Emre?
Well, Turkey is trying to strike the perfect balance between Russia and the Western allies, as it always has done. When you take a look at the traditional Turkish foreign policy, it's always been about this balance, actually. And there were times when Turkish-United States relations were in a crisis back in the 1960s, 70s. So crisis is not something new in Turkish-United States relations or in Turkish-Russian relations. And I think Turkish government is also quite reasonable to know that this is the case. So sometimes people think that Turkey is actually trying to make a strategic alliance with Russia or with another country. I don't think that's the case. I think they are actually trying to use this as a tactical move in order to strengthen their strategic relations with their traditional Western partners. Because when it comes to securing Turkey's interests in the Middle East even, NATO is much more efficient than Russia or any other option.
And going on both your points, NATO is still a relevant force as far as Afghanistan is concerned, contrary to what I was saying earlier, with ISAF troops stationed in Afghanistan, as well as the former Yugoslavia, and Syria, as well as trainers, as Matthew, you were mentioning earlier. So still an opportunity for NATO to be relevant, Matthew.
Yes, of course. I think NATO is going to be relevant to Turkey itself, as far as we can see into the future. If you look at what it means to be Turkish, a Turk's identity, it's partially European. Again, the sort of the center of the Ottoman Empire in many ways was in the Balkans. It being Turkish means to be somewhat Middle Eastern, and it means to be somewhat from the Caucasus, somewhat Black Sea focused, but it is never meant to be Russian. And Turkey has fought more wars against Russia than against any other country dating back to the Ottoman times, and it never worked out so well.
So, but they're still collaborating in Syria, Turkey and Russia. Tell us a little bit about the NATO presence in Syria as well.
Well, of course, NATO is there. Like most of the NATO countries are there. I mean, they have been active in Syria. Like Russia, like Turkey, everybody actually wants to fight the ISIS. This is the greatest threat that everyone sees there. So, and you should also keep in mind that Turkey has been an active collaborator in this international coalition that was founded by the United States. What Turkey is doing there is trying to keep an equal distance with all the parties, and I don't think this is something that we can criticize when it comes to Iran, when it comes to Russia, and when it comes to all the NATO countries, especially the United States.
Thank you so much, Matthew Breiser, Emre Ersin. Turkey has shown its hard power through projection of military strength and statecraft, but that's only part of the story. Turkish television dramas have given the country an unexpected way to project power of a different kind. They're #1 in Europe and are hugely popular elsewhere, from Latin America to the Middle East to the Balkans. But what happens behind the scenes? Here's our Adil Halim with his new segment we call Straight Up.
Turkey is using its soft power to curb anti-Turkish and Islamophobic sentiments across the globe. One way is this. Turkish drama series like this one are taking the world by storm.
Endless Love.
And winning big awards along the way. Kara Sevda, which translates to Endless Love, just won Best Telenovela at the 45th International Emmy Awards, the first ever Turkish production to do so.
Ben ölsem de dava ölmez.
Homegrown dramas routinely reach far beyond the country's borders. The Turkish Exporters Assembly says Turkish TV dramas are now watched by 400 million people in more than 145 countries. The series are often dubbed in several languages: Spanish, Arabic, Persian, and Italian, to name a few. No question, Turkey's TV industry is lit.
There's a remarkable tempo on TV series in Turkey, and I guess people like it. People want to know about our culture.
In fact, the country ranks second for TV series exports, behind only the US. It's not easy competing with Netflix and chill. The Arab world remains the biggest market, largely due to cultural similarities and the Turkish product's high production value. This, despite simmering tensions in the region when it comes to Syria and Qatar. So it's no wonder Turkey sees the small screen as a soft power tool. This success helps boost tourism and has even spawned specialized tours. Fans can see where their favorite shows are filmed and maybe even catch a glimpse of their favorite star. The programming has also encouraged some non-Turkish fans to learn the language. All of this translates into big money. Last year, the government spent 30 million liras on 200 film-related projects, with plans to double that budget this year. Ben hayatta giremem oraya. Now back on set, I decided to give acting a shot. It couldn't be too difficult, right? Well, it's not as easy as it looks. Usually when Turkey is discussed, politics is front and center. But with audiences, both here and abroad, wanting a temporary escape from reality, the hope is that local dramas like Aslan Aylam can push politics to the back burner, at least for a while. No matter the language they're being watched in, their rising popularity may go a long way to show Turkey has a softer side as well. Adil Halim, Strait Talk.
And that's all for this edition of Strait Talk with me, Ali Mustafa. If you've got any comments or suggestions, do share them with us at #StraightTalk. Until next time, take care and goodbye.